Hey guys, welcome to Blue Collar and a Scholar. Tonight, we have a double blessing. We have what I would consider a biblical scholar and a political scholar. And I like to talk about both subjects. So tonight, we're going to pick his brain on the Bible, and then we'll get into politics. This is Professor Francis Beckwith, former president of the Evangelical Theological Society, currently professor of philosophy and church-state studies at Baylor University, affiliate professor of political science, and associate director of graduate studies in philosophy. He's an author of several books. I lost count of how many. Never Doubt Thomas, I think, is your most recent one.
Yes.
The Catholic Aquinas as Evangelical and Protestant. And the book that helped me in my reversion, Return to Rome, Confessions of an Evangelical Catholic. So welcome to Blue Collar and Scholar, Dr. Beckwith.
Thank you, Rob. It's good to be here.
I'm curious, and I think my viewers would be curious. What made you leave the Catholic Church to begin with? You were an altar boy. It seemed like you were really involved as a youngster in the church. And then, like me, I was baptized, made communion, and then never made confirmation. And when I joined the Navy, accepted the Lord in boot camp and became an evangelical for the next 3 decades. Seems like the same thing happened to you. You went a little further, though, made confirmation, I guess.
I did, yeah. So I grew up in a Catholic home. My parents were both Catholics. All my siblings and I were baptized, confirmed, and received Holy Communion. Attended Catholic schools for 12 years, from first grade through high school. I found myself when I was 12 or 13 years old, feeling a sense of wanting to follow Jesus, and found myself deeply influenced by a friend of my parents who had come and visited them and talked to them about his own conversion. He was Catholic and was involved with the Catholic charismatic movement, and he was quite a ruthless businessman, and my parents were really intrigued by his journey, and I, as a 12-year-old, eavesdropped on their conversation in the kitchen. And so I called him up. I mean, here I was, a 12-year-old, about to be 13, called this 50-year-old guy and said, I want to know more about this. And so I asked my parents if I could go with him to this Bible study. And so there was a Bible study that was being held at the home of another older gentleman that was involved with the Catholic charismatic movement. And that led me to meet some people at that Bible study who were not Catholic, who were involved with a local Jesus People church in downtown Las Vegas. By the way, I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Right, yeah. You were born in Brooklyn and moved to Las Vegas, right?
That's right. Born in Brooklyn. And so began going to this Jesus People church in downtown Vegas. And then there I gravitated to the library. There was a library in the back of the church that I think it was the renovated kitchen. There was actually an old house in downtown Vegas that they had turned into a church. And for those who don't know about the Jesus movement, it was kind of the late 1960s, early 70s hippies that underwent conversion experiences. And it really began in Southern California with Chuck Smith and Calvary Chapel. And then I think there was a big Presbyterian church, I think the Hollywood I forget the exact name of it, that was Hal Lindsey was part of it, the guy that had written The Late Great Planet Earth. So I kind of gravitated to that. It wasn't because I rejected Catholicism explicitly. There was a sense of people being on fire and serious about their faith that I just didn't see in the parish and school that I went to. And I want to be kind of gentle here because I don't know, a lot of the criticisms of that era was that, Catholics weren't catechized well. I'm not sure whether that's I don't know. I was 12 years old, I was 13. And, as a 12 or 13-year-old, there's a natural rebellious tendency to want to sort of separate from your family a little bit, right? So I don't know whether if the situation were ideal, it would have been different.
Right.
I don't know. But looking back at my 13-year-old self, I mean, it was clear that I was very much attracted to the enthusiasm and seriousness of the people that I met at Maranatha House, which is the name of the church.
So Chuck Smith was a Pentecostal who then started the non-denominational Calvary Chapel, which actually now is kind of going into a denomination with Greg, Mike McIntosh, and all those guys. And I love those guys as well. Were you a charismatic evangelical? Would you consider yourself charismatic?
I did. I did consider myself that, and went to and attended evangelical churches that were either friendly to the charismatic movement or explicitly charismatic. Right. So in the mid to late 90s, when my wife and I lived in Southern California, we attended an Episcopal church in Newport Beach called St. James that was, I'd say, they would identify themselves as charismatic, but they had a liturgy similar to the Catholic Church. And during that time, my wife, who did not grow up Catholic, turned to me one time after the service and said, "This is really Catholic. Why aren't we Catholic?" And I mean, she was always attracted to the Catholic liturgy. She had a conversion experience in 1982 at Calvary Chapel. So she comes to the Catholic Church when I returned 15 years ago, having had no experience as a Catholic other than my parents, and then meeting among the Baylor faculty, several Catholic faculty and a local Catholic priest that was instrumental in helping move me back to the church.
That's so funny, because I had the same experience. My wife was never Catholic either, but we grew up in the inner city in Irvington and Newark, New Jersey, and back then, kids just walked around the city, and when she was troubled, she would always walk into a Catholic church and feel the presence of God. So me, even though I wasn't biblical theologian or scholar, everything was mental. I had to figure things out. Things had to make sense. And then once I discovered the Catholic Church was a church that Jesus established, I was so excited. And I told her, I want to be Catholic. She's like, we can go back. We can go to the Catholic Church. She was so excited. And I never even knew, as evangelical was 30 years, that she was attracted to it. And she started the next day. She was at daily mass, and she was at daily mass.
That's my wife was the same way. So so when I said to her, I want to return to the Catholic Church, she said, "What took you so long?"
Yeah, this is amazing. Very similar stories over here. That is amazing.
Although all I had to do was to go to confession, whereas she had to go through RCIA, and which kind of bugged her.
Yeah, so my wife wrote a letter to Pope Francis. She never found it, but she's like, "Why can't I have the body and blood of Christ? I've been a Christian for 30 years. I believe it's the body and blood of Christ." But then she humbled and learned why.
So what happened? I mean, we actually cut a little deal. The priest said, "Look, we'll accelerate you being received to my wife. But Frank, me, you have to attend RCIA with her after she's in." So I actually spent the next 7 months after she was received into the church attending RCIA with her.
I would have loved to have taught that class. That would have been amazing. We had a retired Mother Superior running RCIA when I came into the church. And I told her I wanted to be confirmed, and she told me I would have to go through RCIA classes.
Yeah.
And I said, "Mother," at the time I was working, like 75 hours a week, a delivery guy. I said, "I just don't have time." I said, "But I know everything I need to know." So she gave me like a pop quiz, and she said, "Okay, I'll talk to the father." And then I had a meeting with the father, and he let me be confirmed. And then like a month later, she said, "Hey, one of our RCIA leaders had to quit. Can you take over RCIA?"
Wow.
I'm like, "Absolutely." So
cool.
It's pretty cool. But getting back to going back to the Catholic Church, when I was an evangelical, I was a charismatic. And for my viewers, when we say people are open to charismatic movement, so like Calvary Chapel and this non-denominational church that I went to would say, yeah, be open. If God wants to give you gifts, he'll give them to you. Don't deny them. But then like Pentecostal churches or outright charismatic churches will eagerly desire spiritual gifts. That would be the difference. And I received the gift of speaking in tongues, and I was so excited. And I was at like a week later, I went to a Planned Parenthood clinic to protest. And a bunch of these Christians, we held hands and we prayed, and they're praying in tongues. This one guy gave like this powerful prophecy, and he went back there and he's boldly sidewalk counseling. I was like, wow, these guys are on fire. And I'm like, what church do you guys go to? And they go, St. Matthew's. I go, that's funny. That sounds like a Catholic church. And they're like, it is. But that was my first experience. And I was like anti-Catholic at that time. I was reading all these chick tracts and so, but when I became Catholic, I realized that, and I wanted to ask your opinion. You're the expert on Thomas Aquinas here. If you read some of Thomas Aquinas, it seems like he was charismatic, and once he received the gifts of the Spirit, he kind of stood away from the intellectual stuff and got more into the spirituality of our faith. Am I correct?
Well, it's not quite like that. I mean, he did have a kind of mystical experience where he whatever he saw, he told his assistant, he said, everything I've written is nothing but straw.
Wow.
And then he died, I think, within 4 or 5 months after that. He was on his way to a conference in Rome, I think having to do with the Eastern Rite Catholic churches. And on the way there, it's believed that he hit his head when he was on a horse on a branch, and eventually he passed away, I think, a couple of days later. In a local monastery. But I think the story there of Aquinas is basically God gave him a taste of what we call the Beatific Vision. That is, he got to see God as he really is. And I suspect which it doesn't typically happen to people on this side of eternity. And I think if any one of us had that experience, we'd probably say, nothing seems to matter.
So make me home right now.
So I do think, that the right way to look at that is that he's not saying what he did before isn't important. It's just that in comparison to what I just experienced, it seems like nothing. It's like when Jesus says, you should hate your mother and father. You should love God enough to hate you. He doesn't mean it in the sense that you should literally hate them, but that your love should be so great as it would appear to be, almost as if it were hate.
Okay, that's a good point. That makes it understandable. So now, when you were an evangelical, I was amazed that you were the president of the Evangelical Theological Society. And then you decide to become Catholic. So I got a bunch of questions about that. I'll try and limit it. I know reading your book, you said you knew you would have to step down from the presidency, but you thought you could stay on as a member because there were some Eastern Orthodox members. Why didn't you just become Eastern Orthodox? Wouldn't that have been easy? Like Hank Hanegraaff seemed to take that easier way out.
Yeah, well, a couple of reasons. One, it never occurred to me. It never seemed to be an option, and though I got that, by the way, of all the email questions I received, that was actually the most frequent, and that surprised me. I received email from several Eastern Orthodox, former evangelicals who converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, who asked me that question, and I was honest. I said I'd never considered it, but now that I think about it, I think because my parents chose to baptize me in the Latin Rite, and that as a Protestant, I was in schism with Rome, not Constantinople. And so my thinking, setting aside theological questions of why I think Catholicism is more right about things than Orthodoxy, but even if I didn't know any of those things, I would still return to the Catholic Church just because that's the rite that I was baptized and confirmed in.
Okay.
But I've thought about, over the years, thinking about the claims about the papacy. And I think Rome has the better arguments. But I do think Eastern Orthodoxy, I think the break with the Orthodox has negatively affected both bodies. In a way, Rome could use some of that, the aspect of Eastern theology, especially its views on mysticism. We have that, but I think that in some ways Rome is maybe too overly rationalistic,
Okay.
and maybe the Orthodox should be more. You know, so there's something that John Paul II said, that both East and West are the two lungs with which the church breathes, and so in a sense, I think we need both.
Okay.
And I think we've both lost something as a consequence of the schism.
Do you see us ever reuniting in your view, or you think it's not going to
I
happen
don't
until
know.
Jesus comes back?
Stranger things have happened. I mean, if you had asked me on October 30th, 1989, whether I think the Berlin Wall would fall, I would have said
No
no. I
way.
mean, you and I grew up at the same time. I mean, the idea that the Soviet Union would cease to exist was just like it wasn't even on our radar. And yet now we have kids. I have students who obviously have no memory, right? To them, it's history. And so I thought for the rest of my life there'd be a Cold War,
Yeah.
right? So my point is that who knows what could happen? The rise of some of these global movements that are hostile to Christianity may very well force us together,
All right.
right? Who
Like
knows what could happen?
Yeah, it's like Pope Francis said, when ISIS executes Christians, they don't ask them if they're Eastern Orthodox or Catholic. They just ask them if they're Christians. Then they behead them. He called it an
Yeah.
ecumenism of blood that we have with our brothers on the East.
So yeah, that's right. And there is, again, history is a weird thing. We think that we know where it's going, and we don't. And we only kind of have a sense of how things are going based on retrospect. But thinking, I mean, again, going back to the Cold War, I mean, it would have been incomprehensible in the mid 80s to have actually said, yeah, the Soviet Union will be gone in 5 years. It's like if people would have thought you were nuts. So who knows what could happen?
Good point. That's a good point. When you did come over, and I was interested, I told you before we started recording that a lot of your friends are heroes of mine of the faith, even though they're still Protestants. William Lane Craig is one we spoke of. How did he feel when you became Catholic? Did he try and talk you out of it?
No. Bill didn't. It's interesting. He did talk to me about it. As you said, I was president of the Evangelical Theological Society, and I resigned a week after returning to the Catholic Church. But I still was slated to speak at ETS on a panel I had just published a book called Defending Life with Cambridge University Press. It's a defense of the pro-life view on the sanctity of human life. And so there was a panel that was there. So I was still, even though I couldn't give my presidential address, I was still set to speak at ETS. There were going to be 4 commentators on my book, and I was to respond to them. Well, Bill, then there was actually a discussion. I wasn't part of it. I was in the audience, a dialogue on Catholicism and Protestantism. And Bill was there, and he and I were standing outside, and he turned to me and he said, I have no problem with you returning to the Catholic Church.
Wow.
I think, I think you're a Christian. I don't hold that view, but he goes, there's just some things about Catholicism I just don't get. Like, how can you believe in the Assumption of Mary? There's very little historical evidence for it, and it's not mentioned in the Bible. And so I turned to him and I said, Bill, how do you deal with the fact that God orders the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites? And he said, well, I do have it's a difficult passage. I said, but yet you believe the whole Bible anyways, right? So there are things in it that are difficult to understand or that you may find difficult to believe, but because you're committed to Scripture as a whole, you have to have faith that there is an answer to this. Yes. Well, that's the way I think about some Catholic doctrines that I may not fully understand, right? I mean, we do this with other aspects of life, right? So think about something like our civil and criminal law. We don't have to understand every aspect of our civil and criminal law in order to accept the law as legitimate.
That's a good point.
Right. So, the same thing, I think, with our theological beliefs. Not everyone has to be a theologian. And even if you're a theologian, you can't study everything all the time, right?
Right.
So you have to at some point think, well, this is, I think, overall the best account of Christianity. Are there difficulties? Of course there are. In fact, in a weird way, having difficulties adds to the attraction of it.
Mm.
Right? I mean, it's like if you could figure out everything that God told you, maybe he isn't worth worshiping.
Wow.
So I actually think that those mysterious things, those things that are kind of on the edge, they're not clearly they're, there isn't, kind of knockdown historical evidence for the assumption, but the fact is Christians believed it for a really long time, and there's no burial place of the Mother of God. It kind of makes you wonder, well, what happened, right? Because you think about all the saints and all the relics, right? And the one that there was nothing of was Mary. That's kind of weird.
That's very weird. You're right.
So no, that's not a proof, but it does show you that there was something about her transition from this world to the next that is shrouded in mystery. And you find, for example, in very early church, uh, claims about what we today call the Assumption. In any event, that was my encounter with Bill about that. And since then we've done we've done several things together. I've spoken at several conferences that he's invited me to speak at with the Evangelical Philosophical Society. I recently was a referee for a manuscript he submitted to Baylor University Press. His book on the Atonement was published by Baylor.
Oh,
and
nice.
I wrote an endorsement for that. Now, I actually don't agree with everything Bill says in the book, but I thought it was a fine piece of scholarship, and I recommended it to be published.
Nice.
So, I still, in fact, we've actually talked about his Bill Craig Center that he wants to have at a college campus. And so, I talk with Bill, have, conversed with him, and I have great respect for his intellect. He's an amazing guy. I don't know where he finds the time to read and write and speak.
He's all over the place.
It's astonishing. I mean, he will like pick a topic, he'll become interested in something. So he just published this book on the historical Adam. So about 3 or 4 years ago, when he was done writing on the Atonement, he thought, oh, I'm interested in this issue. So he reads everything he can possibly get his hands on, Old Testament scholarship, genetics, history, and then writes this book, which has caused quite a controversy. I mean, there are a lot of evangelicals who don't like the book. So, I mean, I have great admiration. It's called In Search of the Historical Adam. I think that's the name of it. I may have gotten it wrong, but there was an article published on it. Kind of an excerpt from the book published in First Things about 2 months ago.
Okay.
And the thing about Bill that I admire is he's very courageous. So he takes a position on Adam that is really made the young Earth creationists very upset. So I mean that here's a guy that gains nothing by doing that. I mean, in terms of it doesn't expand his constituency. It actually, in some ways, creates enemies to his right.
Yeah.
But why does he?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, but he does it because he's got integrity, right? He just, so I think I find that just astonishing and impressive about him.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I still have friends in the evangelical community that actually my close cousin of mine turned me on to William Lane Craig years ago, and Norman Geisler, all the heavyweights he introduced me to. And I was talking to him recently about William Lane Craig. He's like, oh, he's getting in all kinds of weird theology. So I don't know if that was one of them or not. So I don't. It's you're right. He does have integrity. He's gonna tell you what he believes, and he's gonna teach it. But one interesting thing in your book, when I was, and again, I'm very thankful to you, Dr. Beckwith. You helped me along. Dr. Scott Hahn helped me along. Steve Ray helped me along, but they all had different aspects that I needed to hear. And by the grace of God, I've gotten to speak to all three of you guys, which is a miracle that a blue collar guy is talking to these, great scholars and really, really bright Catholic guys. So what you did that helped me, I was battling. Mary was a big hurdle. Faith alone was a big hurdle. And then you said, once you establish the fact that Jesus Christ gave the Catholic Church the authority, nothing else mattered. Because if they have the authority, then they have the authority. And I started thinking, and then I started like Googling history and all the councils, and I realized, wow, it was the Catholic Church that decided which books would be in the Bible. Council of Rome and Hippo and Carthage, and it's right here. It's the 73 books. I could see it right on Google. And I was like, if I don't trust the Catholic Church, how can I trust my Bible? So I recently reread your book, and something interesting I wanted you to comment on. Yeah. You had mentioned how the Reformers kind of referred back to the Council of Orange, 529 AD, to kind of prove their Calvinism. And you said it actually, their beliefs actually put them partially in the camp of the Pelagianists. And with that, if you could tie in their belief on original sin versus our belief, and their belief on imputation of grace versus our belief of infusion. I mean, that's a lot there, but I think you can.
Yeah, so the Council of Orange was a council that responded to Pelagius, who and also those that followed him that were called semi-Pelagians. So Pelagius held the view that you didn't need God's grace in order to be saved. And so he denied that you needed to be baptized. So because the way the ancient church thought about it is the way the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox think about baptism. The baptism eliminates or imparts grace to you that changes you. Now, Catholics use the language of removing original sin.
Right.
So what's you also find in the Council of Orange, in its canons, an account of the way grace works in people. So in it there are denials that it's up to us, that our initial movement of our will is the result of grace. But once we get that grace, it is up to us to cooperate with that grace in order for God to transform us into the image of Christ. Now, what's weird about that in terms of the Calvinist says you don't need baptism, right, in order to receive that grace. And so that was where I say they're kind of semi-Pelagian. Now, it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek accusation. Right. I mean, I actually don't believe that they're really semi-Pelagian in the sense that they would mean it, right? So a semi-Pelagian is somebody that says you need works and grace.
Okay.
Right. And now the Catholic says, well, it's really not a 1+1 thing. It's really 100% you and 100% God. So if you think about it, it's analogous to the incarnation. So when we talk about Christ being both 100% God and 100% man, we're not saying he's 50-50. He's both. And there's a mystery to it. We don't fully understand it. Another analogy I use in the book is the analogy of Scripture. So oftentimes people will talk about the individual authors, like Paul wrote Romans or Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. But we also say it's God's word. But we don't think that by Paul writing it, it's less God's word. And we don't think that because God inspired it, it's less Paul. So in the same way, grace works that way in us. It doesn't. When God infuses us with his grace, it doesn't mean that we work less, and it doesn't mean we work more. It just means that there's this sort of mysterious cooperation between the grace that God gives us and the activities that we engage in that transform us. And so think of another way of thinking about it. The Catechism does a nice job of saying that grace allows us to exercise our will so that we may be transformed, but God gets all the credit.
Amen.
And so this is So this is when I was talking about the Council of Orange, that was something that I thought that just really blew my mind. I went back and read, because I would go to these reform websites and they'd, cite the Council of Orange. And what's interesting, the one that I went to actually had ellipses, dot, 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 like between the canons that sounded more Catholic. So when you would go to the original and see all of them, it was not as reformed as it seemed.
Wow. And I actually, after I read your book again, I actually went and I didn't see the whole council, but one part of it actually was condemning double predestination, like straight out, clearly saying if you say God preordained you to evil, you're anathema. I mean, how did they miss that part?
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting to read. I mean, this is something that really, and it blew your mind as well. It blew my mind, is how even when like the church fathers like didn't explicitly say things, it was almost as if they're not saying something, said something. So going back to the Council of Nicaea. So Council of Nicaea, which is in the early fourth century, deals with this issue about the deity of Christ and the relationship between what eventually is called the three persons of the Trinity. What's interesting is that they don't discuss apostolic succession or real presence of the Eucharist. In fact, there's no council that until I think the early Middle Ages that even discusses the Eucharist. It's just all assumed. So for me, a lot of what shifted my thinking was not so much that the church, let's say, dealt with a controversial issue, but the ones they didn't deal with, the ones that they just like assumed to be true, right? So this is the great irony. The things we have in common between evangelicals and Catholics: inspiration of Scripture, the doctrine of the Trinity, the deity of Christ. Those were things that councils, maybe not the authority in terms of, I guess they were regional councils that dealt with the books in Scripture, but in terms of the deity of Christ and the Trinity and the nature of the incarnation, those are the things that were actually disputed and they had to have councils for. Now we hold that, now we say, oh, those are the things we hold in common. But the things that we disagree on turn out to be the things that they didn't hold councils on because everyone just assumed they were true.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you're right, this did blow my mind. And the deeper I got into the church fathers and the deeper I got into history, the old saying escapes you now because just the light just flickered over there. Oh. But to be deep into history is to cease to be Protestant.
Yeah.
And that is so true. That is so true. One thing I noticed in your book, you were friends with the original Bible answer man, Walter Martin. And I used to watch him debate Father Mitch Pacwa when I was a Protestant. And I was like, oh, he's got this priest now. And then Father Mitch would come back with another answer. And I was like, And those debates, even though I was a Protestant, actually helped me, I think, a little bit to kind of think about Catholicism. And it was interesting because I always tell this story about how Walter Martin and Father Mitch became friends, but I didn't realize till I reread your book. I got it from you. If you want to share that short story when he got ordained, I thought that's pretty neat.
Yeah. So Father, in fact, I was just on Father Pacwa's show in November. I was on EWTN on, I forget the name of I think it's called EWTN Live.
Okay.
So in 2007, right after I returned to the church, I was invited to be a guest on The Journey Home. And while I was preparing to go on the program, there was Father Mitch Pacwa. And he said, I wanted to meet you. I heard about your story. And I said, do you remember Walter Martin? He says, of course, because I knew that they had debated. And so he said, I'll tell you a story. And he said, when Walter Martin left the American Baptist church to become a Southern Baptist, because the American Baptist had become more liberal, because I was invited to his ordination, and part of the tradition of the Southern Baptists is to invite all ordained ministers who are present to pray for and lay hands on the person being ordained. And so the pastor called all ordained ministers up, and Father Pacwa, out of respect for, it's a Protestant church, he
Right.
stayed in the audience, and Walter Martin looked out in the audience and he said, all Protestant ministers, or all ordained ministers. And so Pacwa got up, and I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure that's actually something he should have done in terms of Catholic.
Walter Martin was kind of bossy, though. It's kind of hard to say to him, I would imagine.
So I met Walter Martin in 1982. He was speaking in Las Vegas. It might have been 83. I think it was January, February of 83. And my friend Dan Green, who had brought him to Vegas to speak, invited me to go out to dinner with Danny, his wife, Debbie, and Walter Martin. And Walter Martin encouraged. I mean, he was a very encouraging voice. I mean, I didn't know him well. I went out to dinner with him once and then talked to him a couple of times. And I've actually gotten to know one of his daughters fairly well. She wrote a book about her father, and I wrote an endorsement of the book. Nice. So Walter, so thinking back, I mean, he died in 1989. All of a sudden, he was actually on his knees praying, and he died of a heart attack. And looking back, I mean, at that time he was 59 years old. And I am now 61.
Wow.
And it's sort of remarkable to think that I lived longer than Walter Martin, who at that time, was my dad's age. And, wow. So he died fairly young. He was not in the greatest of health. I think he had diabetes and had a heart condition. So, but he was one of the several, popular Christian writers that influenced me. Yeah. I'm not sure he would approve of me becoming Catholic.
No. But, So you wrote this book about St. Thomas Aquinas, and a lot of my Catholic friends don't realize that as evangelicals, we all loved St. Thomas Aquinas. We didn't call him St. Thomas; we call him Aquinas or Thomas Aquinas. Why do you think so many evangelicals? And I actually another one of the books that kind of got my attention when I was trying to convert someone into becoming an evangelical who was a Catholic. I read Norman Geisler's book, Is Rome the True Church? And the co-author, Joshua Betancourt, I found out became Catholic like 2 years later. And that kind of got my attention too. And it seemed like Norman Geisler, everyone he taught about Thomas Aquinas went off and became Catholic. And so how come, I can see why, but how come some don't? What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll tell you how I got to read Norm's work. So I actually became friends with Norm and taught for several summers over about an 8-year period at his Southern Evangelical Seminary. I think in 96, let's see, I taught 90, 92, 90, 93, 96, and 2004, maybe 4 times. I spent a lot of time with Norm. So when I was a young evangelical, I would go to the Christian bookstore in town, and I would always gravitate to sort of the heavy theology section. And I was interested in Christian apologetics and faith and reason issues. And so the guy at the bookstore said, we just got this book in called, it was an older book, but it was a paperback edition had just come out. It was Norm Geisler's Philosophy of Religion, and then his later book, Christian Apologetics. And I just simply devoured those 2 books. I just thought so much of what he said seemed to be just commonsensical. It just made sense to me. And I only realized, years later that this was basically kind of evangelical version of Thomism. I didn't realize until even years later after that at least in the evangelical world of those days, that was a minority position to hold. That is, vast majority of evangelical theologians were not Thomists. Now, it turns out that a lot of the philosophers were.
Right.
And I think it has a lot to do with their training. So a number of evangelical philosophers went on and got their doctorates at non-evangelical schools that were either had faculty that were not hostile to Christianity, or were Catholic schools where an evangelical would not feel he'd be around, or she'd be around people that were fellow theists. And so several evangelicals went to places like Marquette, Notre Dame. Some went and studied at University of Southern California with Dallas Willard, the great evangelical Baptist philosopher. And Willard, although not a Thomist, was very friendly to Thomism. He was a scholar of Edmund Husserl, the phenomenologist who also influenced John Paul II.
Wow.
So there was a at least in the subculture of evangelical academics that I was part of, I would say we were top-heavy Thomists, with many who weren't Thomists who were very appreciative and respectful of Aquinas. So I include in that category people like William Lane Craig,
Okay.
who would not consider himself a Thomist, but is very sympathetic to philosophers who are Thomists. In fact, I remember years ago reading an article by a Reformed thinker who accused Bill Craig of being a Thomist, which just because he believed in natural theology.
Interesting.
So you had a lot of folks like that. A number of us were drawn back to the Catholic Church. Others weren't. I can't explain why. I mean, for me, I think it had to do with the fact that I had largely ignored Aquinas's works that dealt with, or the parts of his works that dealt with distinctly Catholic issues. So I read his natural theology, his view of the soul, his view about human knowledge, his view of natural law, but I kind of ignored, his views of the sacraments, of the priesthood. And it was only later that I discovered that, you can sort of separate those things, but for Aquinas, they're all fully integrated.
Interesting.
And so what was also, I think, helpful for me was that Aquinas' understanding of those doctrines that Protestants don't agree with, like the doctrine of justification, or at least the Catholic understanding, is that Aquinas was writing at a time when there was no Protestant Reformation, right? So when he talks about grace and works and faith, there's nothing polemical about it. So he's not responding to the Protestant reformers. So I think that for some evangelicals who read Thomas on that issue, they don't see that he's actually in agreement with the Council of Trent because he's not writing in a polemical way.
Yes, that's a lot what I'll get from my evangelical brothers. Well, he wasn't around during the reformers. If he was, he would have joined them. That's what
some of them say. So in my book, Never Doubt Thomas, my last chapter deals with the doctrine of justification, and I ask the question at the end, well, why couldn't people like Geisler and Sproul and John Gerstner see that Aquinas actually was in continuity with Augustine, Council of Orange, and then subsequently the Council of Trent and the contemporary Catholic Church? Why can't they see it? And my answer is they just loved him. And when you're in love with somebody, sometimes you just don't see those. You just don't see those things, right? And I think they just
that's funny.
They just loved him. And so, but little do I mean. And so what the burden of that chapter is, I do connect the dots. I quote from Aquinas, I quote from Augustine, I quote from the Council of Orange, I quote from Trent, and I quote from the Contemporary Catechism, and it's seamless. It's the same story.
Wow.
That's
beautiful. That's beautiful. I noticed that you had written a scholarly defense of Dr. Scott Hahn when he was recently accused of being a fundamentalist. And I had Dr. Scott Hahn on my show. I've read dozens of his books. And although I haven't read that book, I've read excerpts of it. And it seems like he's talking about someone totally different. So I gave a blue collar defense. I didn't get into the theology or anything. I just got into, I met this guy. I know this guy, and he is, and I was a fundamentalist at some point as a Protestant.
Yeah.
And sorry about that. I had a little background noise. And he's not a fundamentalist. So why would you think this man would attack him? You think it's just for book sales, or you think he really is that naive?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know the gentleman's motives. I was invited to write the review by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. They have an online news paper called Angelus News, and
Right.
so
Yes,
that's
that's
why I
right.
wrote it.
Yep.
And I've also known Scott Hahn for quite a while, as I mentioned at the beginning, that he was quite instrumental in my return to the Catholic Church. He was
As many of us.
one of there were many authors, but his book Rome Sweet Home was
Yeah.
really important to me. And so so I read the book. It's actually right. Believe it or not, this is just I actually
We didn't
have it
plan
right
this.
here. It's right next to me. It's not a very large book. It's about 110 pages. It's based on the author. His name is Sean Swain Martin's doctoral dissertation at University of Dayton, and I was really underwhelmed by it. I mean, I knew it was going to be critical, and I read it with an open mind. I mean, I admire Scott Hahn. I know Scott Hahn. He's a friend, but I understand in the world of scholarship, people can have legitimate arguments
Sure.
and criticisms, and that doesn't mean that you don't admit that there are legitimate criticisms, even if it's about your friend. But I could not believe the quality of it. It was just bad. I mean, and there were so many things in it that were wrong and mistaken, and I think poorly framed and badly argued, that I had taken notes. I think I had like about 15 or 20 single spaced handwritten notations to different parts of the book that I was eventually was going to, part of the taking of the notes was to, in my review, I was going to refer to those parts, but I realized that there's no way that I could. It would be like a 50-page review.
Wow.
So I thought I have to stick to one thing, and so all I stuck to was the accusation that Scott Hahn is a fundamentalist, and so I basically focused on that, and the conclusion I drew was that it's just a crazy accusation. I mean, the term fundamentalist, anyways. I mean, just even if you believe, let's say, that somebody is a fundamentalist, let's say a world-renowned scholar, and you want to convince people that the person's wrong, the last thing you need to do is to call somebody a fundamentalist, because that's kind of a slur,
Right.
right? I mean, you're just like, so you're already going to make people defensive who already like him, right? So if you're trying to get people to sort of gravitate to your position, you don't begin by saying, yeah, he's a fundamentalist, right? I mean, I think it's just a dumb rhetorical move, right? What you want to do is also try to praise the person, right? If
Right.
even I've been critical of certain writers, and I try to find in them things that I agree with or things they do well, and it's almost always in fact, it's always the case
You can always
that
find something
and you I think it's a good thing to show that
great.
oh yeah, the person does this well, and say what you admire about the
Absolutely.
individual.
I
But the
try
book,
to do the same.
so yeah, I think it's I've actually gotten more feedback from that review than in terms of just informal conversations than anything I've done in the past 5 years. So I mean, I was just at church the other day. On Sunday, my wife and I we go to St. Peter's Catholic Center, which is right on the Baylor campus. It's and the daughter of one of my colleagues in art history comes up to me, and she goes, "Oh, I read your review of Scott Hahn's book." I said, and then two of my colleagues, one Catholic and one Protestant, saw me in the hallway and said, "Oh, I read your review of Scott." Each of them separately. I read your review of Scott Hahn. Oh, well, I said, this Angelus News gets around.
Yeah, Scott Hahn's name is he's so beloved by so many people. It's like I call him the godfather of apologetics. You're hitting my buddy. We all want to hit back.
So even my Protestant colleague, Steve Evans, who's an evangelical, he said he's friends with Scott Hahn, and he just thought he had not read the book, but he read my review, and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's appalling."
Wow.
So
Baylor University is just like a non-denominational Christian university.
It is a Baptist. It's affiliated with the Baptist General Convention of Texas.
Okay.
And in order to be on the faculty at Baylor, you have to be a Christian,
okay.
A practicing Christian, or a practicing Jew. So we have about half a dozen, but you have to belong to a synagogue.
That's
And
very
so I think we have about a half a dozen Jewish faculty on campus. They don't teach, in theology or philosophy. I mean, they could teach in philosophy, but they're in other departments. But Baylor is serious about its Christian mission.
that's awesome.
And so, yeah, so when I was interviewed, 19 years ago, I was asked, by the provost. He said, "I know that you believe in the Apostles' Creed, but what do you think about people who don't believe in the Apostles' Creed? Are they wrong?" And I thought that was a great
That
question
is a good question
because it wasn't really about what I believed, which it was about like what I thought was true.
that's a very
Which is a different sort of question, right? So I thought that these people know what they're doing.
That's awesome. Hey, so it's not too often I get to have a biblical scholar and a political scholar. I had my last political guy, Robert P. George, talk politics. He was a heavyweight, and he had said, he said too many Catholics try to separate social conservatism with economic conservatism, and I find that too with a lot of Catholics. They don't feel like economic conservatism helps the poor, and I was like, what are you talking about? Capitalism lifted more people out of poverty than anything. And in your book, you got a very good lesson at 8 years old. I don't know if you remember.
Yes.
If you want to share that with my audience, I thought that was the coolest little thing.
Yeah. So
your
my
dad was
dad,
a very smart man.
so my dad, I forget he used to he made us listen to John F. Kennedy's inaugural address about a dozen times.
That's great.
Which is one of the great, you can get it on YouTube now. It's one of the great, it's where he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country."
That's a great JFK.
I could also do Bill Clinton.
Oh, that's even better.
I feel your pain. I do. So,
I love it.
So in any event, I asked my dad. It was the first time I heard the word communist. I said, "What's the difference between communism? What's a communist country?" And my dad told me about the Iron Curtain and what happened at the Bolsheviks and all that stuff. And then my dad was not an academic. He was an accountant who went to St. John's University in New York, in Queens, and that's where he met my mom. He said the difference between us and in a communist country, he says everyone's treated. He goes in a capitalist country, some people own Cadillacs and some people don't. Whereas a communist country, everybody's treated equally. Nobody has a Cadillac. That was a great line. And
that's awesome.
And so my dad, I guess understood something about the mistake of always thinking about justice in terms of equality. Right. So, I actually think equality is an important value, but it can't be everything, because if equality becomes the lodestar of all our policies, then injustices may very well occur. Wow. Right. So let's say, I live on a street, and people on one side have two eyes and the people on the other side are blind. One way that we can all be equal is the state takes us and removes our eye on the two-eyed people and gives one eye to everybody else, right? And now we're all equal, but is that just?
Wow, that's a great example. That's awesome. So what do you think about these laws? Do you think what our president's trying to do now is unjust? He's framing it, and I know how, I've been following politics since Reagan. I know politicians will put a good name like "Save the Puppies," and it'll have nothing to do with saving puppies. So these voting rights, they're trying to push voting rights, and they're making you out to be a racist if you don't support their definition of voting rights. Do you think what they're trying to do, this federal takeover, is even constitutional? And do you think they know it's not constitutional?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Reagan. He would say, "Well, there you go again." So
that was dead on.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. My students have no memory, so I can't really do that.
Oh, that was perfect. That sounded just like him. That was awesome.
So I've not read the bill, so all I know of it is what I've seen in the media. But yeah, there's an interesting constitutional question here, right? So the Constitution gives certain powers to the states, and one of those powers has to do with elections. And so there's an interesting question about whether the federal government has this power. Now, the fact is that there have been voting rights acts in the past, so that's pretty much, that ship has sailed.
Okay.
Right? So we've had early 1960s voting rights acts, and they've been renewed and changed and amended. So there is already a precedent for that.
Okay.
Now, again, I've not read the details of it, but my sense is that if there's a bill that makes voting that allows people to vote and protects their right to vote, I'm for that. But if in fact it let's say bans, let's say, IDs or certain types of oversight of local governments, I think that's a bad idea, because the franchise, as it's called, I mean, there's two ways that the franchise can be corrupted. One way is the way that we saw prior to the 1960s in the South, in which there were tests for voting, there was intimidation against African Americans. That's one way in which the vote can be, that the franchise can be lost. Another way it can be lost is to dilute it. That is, to not have IDs, to not preserve the integrity of the vote. And so, again, I've not read the legislation, but if it's anything like I've seen occurring at the local level, I mean, New York City apparently is going to allow illegal immigrants or immigrants who
non-citizens.
Non-citizens.
They have a green card. Non-citizens, a million non-citizens are going to allow.
And I think that not only dilutes the vote, it also dilutes something that is precious to being a member of civil society, and that's called patriotism, right? Imagine, you think about something like the love you have for your parents, right? The love you have for your parents has to do with the fact that you are born of them. That is, you may be adopted, but if whether you're adopted or not, the people that you're either born of or bring you up, you have a special relationship to them, and that is something that is cultivated as a consequence of that relationship. The same thing is the relationship that we have with our country or our nation, right? It's cultivated over time, and it's a result of what we give to it and what it gives to us. The fact is that people that just arrive here, even they're given green cards and they're decent people, they don't have that cultivated love. Amen. Right? And that's something that you can't quantify, you can't measure it. And one reason why people die for their country is that that's love cultivated. You can't have a nation where everything is just a matter of kind of disinterested analytics, right? Think about, I don't know if you're a sports fan, but I think baseball has been ruined by analytics, right? Everything, so the same thing. If politics is just a matter of number crunching and people getting a vote if they pay taxes, you lose the kind of natural civil society that arises from families and communities that organically develop.
Well, that's a very good point.
So I think that, so it's here I'm making an argument that the bad thing about that isn't that just merely the fact that people aren't citizens or voting, but that being a citizen is more than just, sticking around long enough and getting your name and passing a test, getting your name on a list and passing a test. It's part of being
the difference of dating a woman and marrying that woman.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. It's the difference. It's like, this is why people think of like a mail order bride as being kind of despicable, right? We don't want to judge people too much about that, but we do judge it, right? So in a weird way, allowing green card people to vote is like a mail order bride version of voting, right? It's a mail order cisizen.
And
it kind of diminishes a little bit, right? We even think that about overnight Vegas weddings, right? That sort of doesn't have the same. We think, okay, they're legally married, but come on,
Yeah, to pint of vodka.
Yeah.
I just want to wrap this up. I want to get your opinion on this. There's a big case in front of the Supreme Court now, the Mississippi abortion law. What's your sense listening to the arguments? You think they're going to strike that down, and you think there's a possibility that we could finally overturn Roe versus Wade?
I think Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. Now, of course, the opinion that's now the Supreme Court's real precedent is a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey,
right?
Which upheld the core of Roe, but changed a few things. But one of the things it said, though, is that the core of Roe says that the state cannot regulate abortion in terms of proscribing it prior to viability. But what the law in Mississippi does, it prohibits abortion after 15 weeks, which is at least 5 weeks before viability. So if the law in Mississippi is upheld, then Roe v. Wade and Casey will in fact be overturned. I mean, that's the only way to do it.
Okay.
It's difficult to imagine a way for them to somehow uphold Casey and Roe and still uphold the law in Mississippi.
Okay. Now, before I let you go, since you're such a bright man, what would be your best argument for the pro-life movement? If you were speaking to someone who was a non-Christian, I mean, we know if you're a Catholic, we're commanded to be pro-life. But if you're a non-Catholic or if you're non-religious, what argument do you give to defend life?
Boy, that's difficult to sort of do it in a quick, snappy way. But
Sorry.
I mean, I think the first question that I would do it in the form of a question. I wouldn't present an argument. I would ask, what do you think unborn life is? I think ultimately the question in abortion is who and what are we, and can we know it? And the question also could be framed in this way: is the unborn human being one of us? And that's the question I would ask. Is the unborn human being one of us? Did you exist in your mother's womb? So if you have rights now and you existed then you're the same being.
Very good. Well,
so I think that's
a snappy little argument. That was a good one.
Thank you.
So thank you. Doctor, I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate you hanging in there. My viewers don't realize we had some technical difficulties. It took us about 15 minutes to get this together, but I thank you for hanging in there with me, and I was honored and privileged to have you as a guest tonight. If you ever want to come back, you have an open door, sir.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. Delighted to be here.
All right. God bless.
All right.